Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to SunoikisisDC Digital Classics. Today is our second session of this autumn term for the academic year 21-22. And today I would also like to welcome my students in Leipzig because technically they are joining this course today. We started last week with this term of SunoikisisDC Digital Classics, but given that this program is an international program, we have students from different universities, different departments in different countries. And so we have different academic calendars. So given that I'm starting this session, welcome to my students. For my students, you know that you have information about the program, each class outline in GitHub. But for Leipzig students, you also have links in Moodle. Okay, you know that. And in any case, you can email me, and then we can meet every week for other information. But today, today is our second session of this term, which is more about, let's say, digital philology, if we have to characterize our terms. And this second session is about text encoding, and is the first of two sessions about text encoding, because we will have another session about text encoding in a few weeks. And today the session is about EpiDoc, and our guests today are, well, Gabriel Bodard. I don't need to introduce Gabriel because you know him quite well. He's the director of the program with me, and he has contributing so many times to our sessions. And then Polina Yordanova from the University of Helsinki. I don't think I needed to introduce Polina because you know her for her work. She is a PhD candidate in Helsinki. She has been working a lot in the community, especially for EpiDoc. She's an expert of EpiDoc, and this is the reason why today she's with us. And now she's working on her project about papyri in Helsinki for papyri, so for linguistic annotations of papyri. The session, you have, as usual, the class outline in GitHub with the description of the session outline, seminar readings, further readings, and then you also have an exercise that will be explained and commented later during these. You have two exercises, yes. It will be explained later in the session. And as you can read in GitHub, this session is an introduction to the principles of XML markup for transcriptions and critical editions of ancient text, and we will see examples in the session. But now I think we can start, and Gabby is starting, so please, Gabby. Okay, so.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Monica. That's great. So, yes, just a quick note for anyone who's watching this on YouTube and not via the Sunoikisis page that Monica mentioned. The link to that GitHub page that Monica mentioned is below this video. You may need to expand the description, and the link is down there. Also, anyone who's not watching live, welcome to the video anyway. If you are watching live, please feel free to comment in the live chat on the right of the video or below the video, depending on your screen. And we'll discuss and have questions later as well. So let me just quickly put my screen up there. So I'm going to start this session, and then Polina and I are going to talk about a couple of things each. The general outline of the session is as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about epigraphy, about the Leiden System, and about EpiDoc, just as a conceptual introduction. Polly's going to talk about XML. What is XML? What are the rules of XML? I'm no longer sure exactly which. If I get the persons wrong in this, Polly, you'll have to correct me. But I think then I'm going to give a brief demo of marking up a Latin ostracon in EpiDoc using the Oxygen XML editor. Polly's going to give a brief introduction to abbreviations, which are a little bit more complex than simply following a quick reference page. I will do the same then on the subject of lacunae, gaps and restorations. Polly will talk a bit more about editorial corrections, and then we will present the exercise and we'll have some discussion at the end. So I think that's the order of events. One note is that we've made this entire slideshow Creative Commons licensed, so you're welcome to download it. There's a link to it on the GitHub page. You can either look at this the Google presentation that I'm showing now, or you can download a PDF of it and take it away and do things with it. And part of the reason that we put everything in Sunoikisis on Creative Commons license, but we've also been obliged to do so for this, because a lot of the slides in this presentation, as well as being some by Polina and myself, are also slides produced by other members of the EpiDoc community and all licensed under Creative Commons licenses. So so a lot of this is building on existing work. So a quick sort of background on Epigraphy and the Leiden System, which is the main transcription system for epigraphic and papyrological texts. If you're at all familiar with Epigraphy, you'll be used to seeing things like this edition in print. Epigraphy is basically the study of, or the transcription of, and the creation of editions of texts that survive from earlier periods because they were written on stone or on other durable materials, usually meant for display in some sort of public way, and that have survived sort of by accident, although they probably were intended to survive a certain amount of time. People have been doing epigraphy in the broad sense for about as long as people have been writing on stone. There are references in classical Greek authors from the 5th century and earlier where they mention seeing things written on stone, and Herodotus, for example, the historian, talks about using inscriptions as evidence for some of the historical events he narrates. He talks about commemorations that have been put up and decrees that have been put up and so forth occasionally. And so we know about people in earlier generations having done epigraphy. And people have been doing this, in the Middle Ages, the people were looking at ancient inscriptions. But we have things like, we have the Byzantine various anthologies that were poetry that had been found in inscriptions that were edited and published and so forth. But until the modern period, and probably really even the 19th century, when people described what they saw on an inscription, they really gave you the text, and they didn't give you much information about the text. From the 19th century, people really started codifying what was going on in the text. When there were gaps in the text, because these inscriptions are very old, they're sometimes damaged, those gaps are restored. There are other kinds of revisions and corrections, and abbreviations are expanded and things like this. And so they came up with more or less conventional ways of recording this information, of the kind that you can see some of these brackets and other symbols, non-alphabetic symbols in this text. But it wasn't until 1931 when the papyrologists agreed something called the Leiden System. This was at a meeting in Leiden in 1931, where they said this is what a square bracket means. So we have square brackets, which mean restored text. You have parentheses, which mean expansion of abbreviations, and angular brackets, which mean correction of errors. And so these are what we call the Leiden System, or the Leiden Conventions. So various things that appear as part of either the Leiden Conventions proper or other conventions used in epigraphy and papyrology, you can see examples of in this text. So there's the brackets that I just mentioned. There are other kinds of symbols which turn up, so the dots beneath characters, the numerical markers after characters, and there are a few other things which are typographical conventions which are not unique to epigraphy, such as the hyphens at the end of lines and the line numbers in the left margin that you see in other kinds of text as well. But all of these we can broadly talk about in terms of the conventions of recording a transcribed inscription or papyrus text. This is a very brief overview of the main conventions in the Leiden system. So those underdots that I mentioned for ambiguous letters, the square brackets for completely lost letters, either not restored if they're just replaced with dots or dashes, or restored, letters that were erroneously omitted, and so we're correcting that error by restoring them, or if we're not restoring them, we're just saying that something was omitted here, we don't know what. Abbreviations that are written on so that we expand to make life easier. Letters which were inscribed on the stone, but we consider that they were inscribed in error, they're therefore superfluous, and errors. Characters which were written on stone and have since been deleted, possibly deleted immediately after they were written, or possibly a generation later, or so. But we can consider that deliberate deletion, erasure, rather than just damage, from the elements or so forth. So that's a sort of brief introduction to what epigraphy is, and Pepperology is for the purposes of this is very similar. It tends to be things written on portable objects rather than monumental objects. So things like written on pieces of papyrus, on ostraca, on writing tablets, and so forth, that were really meant for reading rather than meant for display. Let's say I'm oversimplifying, but the distinction between the two is a little bit arbitrary anyway. So I don't feel I'm doing anyone a great injustice by oversimplifying in that way. So EpiDoc is it's a set of conventions for transcribing inscriptions of papyri in digital form for digital publication and analysis of one kind or another. This doesn't replace the Leiden system. It in fact is it's very much just a mapping of one set of pre-existing art, which is the Leiden system, the distinctions recorded by the Leiden system and its various later incarnations, to another piece of prior art, which is the TEI system, the Text Encoding Initiative recommendations for using XML to mark up literary or linguistic texts. And so what EpiDoc is, to really simplify, is it's a mapping where you would do this in Leiden, do this in TEI XML. So this enables us to create an unambiguous, but just as arbitrary as Leiden, digital encoding of the text. Likewise, we don't just encode the physical state of the transcribed text, we also encode other information about an inscription or a papyrus that would normally be in the database or in the printed edition of a publication of this sort of text. For example, the fields recognized by the various different databases in the Eagle system, or other disciplines, other databases such as the papyri.info for Pepperology and so forth. So I'll illustrate what that means in a moment. What EpiDoc has produced in this, or what EpiDoc is in concrete terms, is a set of guidelines. It's saying, if you have this phenomenon you want to encode, here is the XML you should use to encode it. It's a set of reference star sheets, that is to say, the scripts that will turn those XML files you've created into human readable publications and indexes and various other kinds of materials that we want to produce from our editions. It is a schema, which Polly will explain in a few minutes what a schema is, for defining the rules of XML that EpiDoc files follow. There is a easy to use off-the-shelf EpiDoc publication tool called EFES, which we will mention again briefly at the very end, although that's not something we'll talk about in great detail today. There is a lot of material produced by the EpiDoc community for training materials as part of the training program, and there are various third-party tools which are not produced by the core EpiDoc community, but by other people who use EpiDoc. So they're produced by the EpiDoc community, but not by the EpiDoc committee, as it were. EpiDoc doesn't claim responsibility for these other tools. We make certain assumptions normally when teaching EpiDoc, and this slide sort of summarizes some of those assumptions, but I probably don't want to talk about that very much right now. So So I'll having left that slide up for a few seconds, I'll leave that to your imagination to understand what that's about. But just to go back to the Leiden system for a moment, I've introduced this set, and it's clear that this is a set of arbitrary symbols. Arbitrary in the sense that square brackets don't in any for any reason need to mean missing letters, and angle brackets mean erroneously omitted letters, any more than they could be the other way, just by convention that they're understood in that way. So XML is just another arbitrary system, another well-documented and recorded and widely agreed arbitrary system for recording the same kind of information, but in XML. As you can see, it's a lot less terse than the Leiden, but that makes it more easily machine processable in various ways. And it also makes it much more compatible with all of the other projects, non-classical projects, that also use the TEI XML guidelines for encoding literary and linguistic texts of one kind or another. Likewise, we have the various features of an edition of an inscription, such as those you find on this, which is from the Heidelberg database of Roman inscriptions, which can also be mapped to XML, as you can see on the right-hand column here. This is how we say things about where an inscription was found, where an inscription is now, under whose governance this inscription is kept, what is the original date of this inscription, well, where are the earlier publications of this inscription, and so forth. On which note, I will hand over to Polly to talk a bit more. Having shown you those snippets of XML, I'll hand over to Polly to talk a bit more about XML. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabby. Okay, this will be a very short and brief explanation of what XML is, but I'm hoping that as we go, you will get the feel for it, and soon you will be writing yourself some XML, and you'll be seeing lots of examples of it. So you'll get the hang of it. So XML stands for Extensible Markup Language, but it is not itself a markup language. It is, generally speaking, the set of notation, grammar, and syntax that allows us to write encoding languages, such as HTML in TEI and so forth. You know, EpiDoc also being part of TEI. Also, it allows us to do semantic tagging of information that is both machine readable and human readable, which makes it very powerful and also very accessible to learn and use. Let me give you a quick example illustrating what I mean by semantic tagging and human versus machine readable encoding. On the right, we have 3 examples of different conventions for bibliographic references in which we are guided by the human readable markup in figuring out which part is the author's name, which part is the title, when it was published, etc. However, if we were to encode the underlying information here in tags that are recognized by the machine, we would be able to produce any of these 3 variants by simply setting the rules for what happens with the author's name, whether we put the surname first and the forename afterwards, or whether we abbreviate one of them, whether the year goes directly after the author's name or in the end, or whether we need to italicize anything, and so forth. The building block of XML is what we call an element. An element usually consists of an opening tag here, and which is a string of some letters that is delimited by an opening angle bracket and a closing angle bracket, some content optionally, and then ending tag, a closing tag, which is a repetition of the opening tag, but with a slash right after the first opening angle bracket. Sometimes an element might not have any content, and in this case we call it an empty element. And there is also a shorthand for presenting an empty element, which is, instead of having 2 tags, with the closing one having the slash right after the left angle bracket, that's the left angle bracket, we can have only 1 tag, which has the slash right before the closing right angle bracket. And this means that this element has no content, and therefore we call it an empty element. Elements, both those with content and the empty ones, can have attributes which give us further specifying information for that element. So although the same string of text is both in the opening and in the closing tag, attributes only go in the opening tags. The attribute is put right after the name of an element and is separated by it via a space. Its value is presented in inverted commas after an equal sign, and if the element has multiple attributes, which it can, they can be separated by a space, and also if an attribute has multiple values, they also all go inside the inverted commas and are separated by white spaces. However, we should be very much aware of the fact that no kind of markup can go inside an attribute's value. So the value of an attribute can only be a string of letters, numbers, whatever, but we cannot have any angle brackets inside, no other kind of markup. So as you might have probably caught up already, the white space in XML has a very important role, but only in terms of whether it is present or not. For example, inside elements, as we saw, it separates the element name from the attribute, as it does here. And when it's not present, the attribute is not recognized as such at all. It is rather interpreted as a part of the element's name, and whatever follows is not picked up at all by the XML editor. It's just something that is an error. Sorry. And it's going to be flagged as an error. Also, it is important inside an element's content, much like it is in a normal text, because it can separate words, and also we don't want it to appear anywhere where we don't want to be separating words. Also, it can be in between elements, it can be meaningful in between elements, and in the following two examples, we can have two very different results depending on how we decide to transform them. So where we put the space and whether we put it is very significant in XML. However, how much or even what type of space we're using is not significant at all in XML, as it does not differentiate between a space or a tab, or even between one space and a line break with 20 spaces, as in here. These are all exactly the same things in an XML file. Often, in fact, for the sake of better legibility of the code, for example, when we want to avoid very long lines that we need to scroll horizontally through, we can move something on a new line, but we should not put line breaks whenever there wasn't a space to begin with. For example, here, since we had the space in imperator already, it's fine to just move that part on a new line. But if we do introduce a new line whenever there wasn't one, we are already creating a space, and therefore we are making problems for ourselves. So as I mentioned, XML uses plain Unicode, but it has rules regarding the use of certain special characters. Because all tags are delimited by the angle brackets, we cannot just use them for anything else. If we need to use the lesser or greater than signs in our text for whatever reason, we need to escape them. And this is done with the so-called entity. An entity is something that starts with the ampersand and ends with the semicolon. These entities are set. For example, the entity for for the lesser than is LT, the entity for greater than sign is GT. And since ampersand is apparently something that also means something in XML, it also needs to be escaped if we're going to be using it for anything else other than defining an entity. So the way to escape an ampersand is with the entity amp. We can also use entities in order to have in our XML documents characters that cannot be entered using the ordinary Unicode. For example, this black square here is represented as such, and this will be picked up in the XML document. Looking now at the bigger picture, an XML document has a tree-like structure in which the element can contain other elements and in turn be contained themselves. A common way we call these relationships is by kinship terminology. So if we focus on this child element over here, we can say that the element that contains it is its parent. And the element that is in the same place in terms of the structure of the tree is its sibling. An element that contains our two elements, not directly, but upper in the tree hierarchy, is called an ancestor element, and so on. So the parent of our parent element here is actually the one that we've called ancestor. A very important rule to have in mind is that the entire XML document must be contained within a single element, and we call this element the root. In our little example here, the root element is the TEI. So we must be very careful when we're writing our elements in their tree-like structure, that they're wholly contained by all of their ancestors and they do not overlap. So in this example here on the left, we have the opening tag of the sibling element, but we're not closing it within its containing parent element. We are closing it afterwards, and this will be picked up as an error by our XML editor. Here we have two sibling elements that have been overlapped, and this is also something that cannot happen. So if we open something, we need to close it before we open something else. Now, here is a demonstration of some nesting issues that may arise just because if we substitute human-readable markup with machine-readable markup without keeping in mind the limitations that we have imposed by the XML structure, we might get into a little bit of a trouble. So here we have a book. It is the parent of a page, and a page is a parent of some paragraphs that are siblings here. So we have started a paragraph on this page, and then apparently in the book that we were encoding, the paragraph continues on the next page. So the annotator here has closed the tag of the page element, opened a new page element, and continued writing the tag, and only closed the paragraph element over here. But this cannot be done in XML because you cannot have elements that are not contained by their parents entirely, both opening and closing tags. So there are two ways to fix this issue. The first option is to just close that paragraph before we close the page element. And this might not be something that we actually want to say that is true. We don't say that the paragraph ends on the first page and then another paragraph begins on the second page. So, we might opt for another option, which is to use the empty tags that I showed you in the beginning, which don't constrain us by having to close them anywhere. And after all, a page is not something that contains any textual content itself. In our example, it's just something that indicates that a new page begins. So we can escape the necessity of opening and closing the page element by using it as an empty element. So let's quickly summarize the 5 rules of a well-formed XML. So an XML that can be processed by the machine and that is conforming to all the grammar and syntax of the XML markup language. So first of all, the whole document must be contained by one root element. All elements must be wholly contained by all of their ancestors. All open elements that are not of the empty kind must close, and there must be no missing angle brackets or slashes or inverted commas in tags and around attribute values. And if you must use any of these special characters anywhere else in your document, other than in their special uses as delimiters of tags and introducing entities and so forth, they must be escaped. Now I'll briefly mention the schema that Gabby talked about in the beginning of this lecture. This is something that you can make use of if you open XML in a proper XML editor. So XML being a plain text document allows you to just open it in any editor, even in a notepad. But if you are using a proper XML editor, you can set up a list of rules for how your XML document should be structured. And this is called the schema. So schemas are used by projects to ensure consistency and to make creating XML documents and managing their content easier. You can use them as a guide rail for writing your document, and you can also use them to validate your file, so to see whether it conforms to those sets of rules that have been defined by the project that you're writing this document within. The most useful thing that comes out of schemas is that they provide a contextual menu of elements and attributes, and you can set them up even to give you attribute values that are available to you at any point in the document. So in the EpiDoc schema, there is a certain place that is for the metadata that we have of that text that we are describing, something that talks about the appearance of the monument. We have a part that is dedicated to the bibliography, a part that is about the text transcription, and everything is set according to that schema, so that you know when you are allowed to use certain elements and certain tags. It's good here to remind you that a well-formed document is something that is your responsibility. You're responsible to write well-formed documents where you close all of your open tags and you don't make any exceptions to the 5 rules that we saw in the previous slides. But it is the XML editor's responsibility to take care of the validation after you have provided it with a schema with a set of rules. And Gabby, over to you.
Thank you. Having got the basic rules of XML, that's what those are the rules that we have to follow. I just want to give an example then briefly of how we go about editing this in EpiDoc. So for this example, we're going to use a Latin ostracon, which is taken from the papyri.info project. This is an example of what's called a papyrus, although it's actually written on a scrap of pottery. There's 2 steps to this. One is on the GitHub page for this session, there is a link to a PDF called the EpiDoc quick reference. This is the shorter quick reference. There's a longer one which is 2 pages long, but this is the minimal quick reference file you need. And what I'll ask you to do is to go and get hold of that quick reference file, and possibly even better if you can print it out or maybe be looking at it on a tablet or something beside your screen, so that you can refer to it without having to constantly flick between screens. And so this is a slightly more complex version of the very brief table I showed you of how the Leiden square brackets correspond to the EpiDoc supplied reason equals lost with the characters inside that element. And so you can see from Polly's description, we have here an element with its element name, its attribute and its value, its element content, and then the closing tag there. So the first thing I want you to do is to have access to this and have a quick glance down this page of the file. Please feel free to pause this demonstration at any point so that you can follow along at your own time. The second thing we need is from this address in the top right hand corner there. Again, apologies that is partly obscured by the StreamYard logo, but that says the last 4 characters are NJEM semicolon 3 there at the end. That's the Oscars from Bodard. You could probably guess that from the title at the top here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this text here, and I'm going to go into the Oxygen XML editor using an EpiDoc template, which I think we gave you a link to the EpiDoc template, but if we forgot, I will add that very quickly at the end of the session. But I think we did. And using the Oxygen XML editor, this is the EpiDoc template downloaded down in there, opened in the Oxygen XML editor, and I'm simply going to scroll down in this template until I reach the div type equals addition and the text which says Greek or Latin text, etc. here. And I'm going to delete that part there because that's just telling us what we want there, and I'm going to paste in there the text that I copied from that other slide. Okay, so we can see all of that in there. And for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to very briefly, and I may not get to the end of this this example, but just enough to get for us to see what's going on. I'm going to replace all of the human-readable Leiden System and other conventions of this edition with EpiDoc TEI XML tags and elements to represent this, the same information. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to remove these 3 footnote markers which point to the apparatus criticus, because that's not strictly part of the Leiden system. And if you want to know what you would do with those, the aqua is written where more conventional Latin would read aquam, prepositum would more conventionally be praepositum, caecilius would more conventionally be caecilius, etc. Then if you go to the papyri.info page that I linked to, you will see what they've done with that. They've turned them into footnote markers to an apparatus criticus, and they've tagged them in XML. But for the sake of this example, I'm not going to do that. So the first thing we need to do is that, remember, Polly told us that the type of and a quantity and type of whitespace in an XML file is not meaningful. So the fact that there is a space after the end of this line and the line break is just a kind of space. It's a subset of whitespace. Means nothing more than if it were just a space on the file. So to tell the EpiDoc file that there is a new line on the stone here, we need to use the LB tag. There's already one there for the beginning of the first line, because LB means line begins, and so the first line begins at the beginning of the file, and then at the beginning of each other line we need another one of these. So I'm going to do this the lazy way, and laziness for the purposes of the rest of this program really is a virtue. So if there's ever an easier way to do something, do it the easy, the lazy way. So I've simply copied that. I'm going to paste it in at the beginning of each line. Like that. And of course, not each of these is line 1, so it's a lot quicker for me just to renumber the lines. And you see that 5 that was there in the margin, that's just telling us it was line 5. So we can now delete that line, that 5. 6, 7, 8, 9. It's quicker if you can type 10. Again, there's that 10 in the margin, which we can delete. 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's the first part. We can also, if you want to nest this whole thing just to make it a little bit neater, we can do. That changes nothing, but it makes it look nicer on the screen. Then there's a few other things that we can put in there. This I at the beginning of unias is in square brackets, which means that it is lost from the original support and is being replaced by the editor, because the editor is pretty clear that when you've got 13 cal something unias, it must be unias, must be the name of the month. So we simply take that character, which is currently in square brackets, and we add instead the supplied element around it. And notice that by using that, I pressed Command E there to get that menu up. That puts in both the opening and the closing tag for me at the same time. Once that supplied is there, it needs to say supplied reason is lost to be valid. Once that supplied is in there, the square bracket is now redundant, so we can delete those square brackets. So always we will add some EpiDoc markup, and then we will remove the more conventional Leiden markup. These underdotted characters are unclear. So again, I'm going to press Command E, type unclear, or in fact I just typed the first couple of letters of it and it's restored. That's unclear. I now want to remove those underdots. That can be a bit tricky. You might end up removing the wrong thing there, but anyway, I didn't. I removed the right thing. The abbreviation, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but this is a little bit more complicated than just replacing the brackets, because we actually have to add 3 things in here. We want to add something to say that the word numerous is an expanded word, that the character N is the abbreviation. While we're here, well, no, I'll come back to that, and that the characters numerous are the expanded part of that abbreviation. So we've put 3 different tags on there. Once we've done that, we can remove those parentheses as they are redundant. There is also this underdotted character nested inside that, so I'm going to also tag that as unclear and delete that underdot. Okay, and this has automatically line wrapped for me, but I'm actually going to put in a hard line break there because I don't want that that expand to ever disappear off the right-hand screen, the right-hand edge of my screen. There are these three underdots at the end of the line, which I can tell you in papyrological convention means that there are traces on the papyrus or on the ostragon here of what must be 3 more characters, but we can't read them, and we're not going to attempt to restore them. In fact, it must be a number, and therefore it's pretty hard to guess what that number might be. So we're simply going to say that there is a gap in the inscription in the text here. And note that here, rather than pressing Command E to enter it, I just typed angle bracket gap / angle bracket because it's just slightly quicker. You can always do one or the other. Gap, notice, is an empty element. There's that slash at the end of it, and it requires 3 attributes. One, it requires a reason. This is a gap, not a gap reason lost, but it's a gap reason illegible. These characters are visible, there are traces of them on the stone, but we cannot read those traces. It's not that they were completely lost. Second thing we need to say is the unit. Is this a gap of a few characters, of a few lines, of a few pages, of some dimension, etc.? In this case, it's characters. And then the quantity of those characters is 3. Okay, having done that, I can now delete those 3 dots at the end of the line. And I'm going to put in another hard line break there. So you notice that what was just a small amount of text on one line has now become 3 lines of XML. And I haven't even marked up this other abbreviation yet, which I can do very quickly. This is expand aber x. And I haven't marked up this number, which we can also tag up. That's a numeral, which I can say has a value of 13, etc. Which makes this even longer. I've now got 4 lines of XML. That's partly because I've got a very large font on here to make it visible on the screen. But I think pretty much everything in this text is another example of something that I've already shown you in this first line, so I'm not going to go through the entire text. If you want to, feel free to go and make a copy of that and try it out yourselves. I think that's fine. There is a question I see in the chat. When is a reason needed? Okay, a reason is needed on the supplied element. A reason is always needed because in TEI, you can say a character is just supplied, but you can also say that a reason for why it is supplied. What sort of problem with the text has caused you to have to supply this character there? In EpiDoc, however, because we're based on the conventions of the Leiden system, Leiden distinguishes completely unambiguously between square brackets around some characters, meaning these are supplied because they were completely lost, between angular brackets around some characters, which means these were supplied because they were erroneously omitted, and at least one other kind of supplied that I can't now remember. But because we have to be unambiguous about that, because we're following the existing standards for epigraphy and papyrology, we always have to supply a reason attribute on the supplied element. Okay, the quick reference document that I showed you will always tell you whether you need that attribute or not. So just follow the quick reference document or the guidelines. But good question, thank you. There is one other thing on here that I haven't given an example of, and that is just down here on the last line. there is a square brackets with this circa inside it, question mark. What this means is, again, this is a gap, reason lost. So gap, like supplied, always has to have a reason attribute. It's a gap reason lost, it's in square brackets. It is a number of characters, because it's not a complete line. It's some characters at the end of this line are missing. But in this case, the extent of this gap is unknown. We know it's a number of characters, we don't know how many characters. Okay, and having encoded that, I can remove the Leiden tags there. Is there anything else you want me to show an example of, Polly or Monica?
I think that was pretty clear, unless there are any other questions.
Cool. We'll come back to more questions at the end. Yeah, great. I'll pass over to Polly then. We've still got a few things to get through.
Okay, I will talk now a little bit about abbreviations because they have this special treatment in EpiDoc, and Gabi already showed you a little bit of how to do them, but I will now explain why he did what he did. So let's say we have on the stone AUG, which is an abbreviation for Augustus. And the way we treat this in EpiDoc is by dividing this into its three meaningful parts. So we have the thing that is on the stone, which is AUG. We have the thing that we want to supply whenever we are displaying the critical edition, ustus, the continuation of the word. And then we have the whole word as we want it to be perceived, Augustus. And for this, in EpiDoc, we have a set of three tags that we are using. So the thing that appears on the stone, the abbreviation itself, goes inside an aber element. The part that we need to expand is tagged as an X, and the whole thing that has been expanded already is expand. And this is how they nest, how they would look like in your XML document. Expand surrounds the whole abbreviation. Aber goes around the part of the text that is visible on the stone, and X surrounds the part that you are expanding. And so this allows us to generate different versions of that same annotation, depending on what we need to do with them. So in the critical edition, this allows us to put the expansion inside brackets, while whenever we want a diplomatic edition, it will capitalize whatever is contained inside the aber element, and it will only display this. Sometimes we have abbreviations that we cannot make much sense of, and therefore there is no point to expand them into anything, like we have here, hor. This hor is not meaningful for us, and therefore we can just tag in aber, the tag for abbreviation, the thing that is on the stone, those three characters, and again, our transformation scenarios are set so that in the critical edition, it will appear lowercase with some dashes inside the brackets showing that we could not expand this abbreviation, and the diplomatic edition, it will be all capitalized. Now, we have a tricky one here. When we have abbreviations that are more complex and are comprised of different parts, so we can have AUG with another get over there that indicates that we're talking about two Augusti duo. Oops, sorry. In this case, what we do is we actually treat the second G here as an abbreviation mark, because this is the thing that indicates that this is an abbreviation, and actually we're talking about two Augusti. And much like in the previous example, we need to put an expand element around the whole abbreviation. We put everything that is on the stone inside the aber element, but the bit that we're treating as the abbreviation mark goes inside its own special AM abbreviation mark element, so that whenever we are actually displaying this in the critical edition, we get the option not to have the second G appearing here. Remember, we don't want to have Augusti duo displayed. We want to treat this G as simply the thing that abbreviates and gives us the information about the two Augusti. While as in the diplomatic edition, we can get our G back so that it is displayed the way it is displayed on the stone. And summary of how abbreviation goes. We have expand, which is the thing that goes around the entire expanded word. It is the outermost element. Inside it, we have abr, which is the part of the abbreviation that is on the stone, that is visible there. And this is the thing that will be displayed in a diplomatic edition without any editorial intervention. Then in X, we have the parts that we are expanding in order to resolve the word. And in case we have any abbreviation marks there, we can put them into their own dedicated element, which is AM, abbreviation mark. This is also used whenever we have symbols or characters there representing entire words like sestertius or denarius or things of such kind. And this is my lightning fast presentation of what abbreviations can be. Gabby, back to you.
Great, thank you, Polina. Yeah, the one thing I'd add just to that is that in all three of those examples that Polly showed, the tags meant exactly the same thing. Even though they were slightly different kinds of abbreviation, the abr tag always meant this is the part that is on the papyrus, and not. But it would need to be expanded to be a full word. Whether we know what we're expanding it to or not, it always means the same thing. So what looks like a fairly complicated way of marking things up actually is actually quite simple if you note that you're doing the same thing, whatever kind of abbreviation you're using. Okay, so again, I'll try to race through this fairly quickly. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of slightly more complex examples of lacuna. We had examples in our Ostracon of characters that were supplied because they were lost, characters in square brackets, and we had examples of characters that were lost and not supplied, that were a gap reason lost, with dots or dashes or the word circa question mark inside those square brackets. So for this, I want to talk a couple of inscriptions for this example. And I'll spell this out in case you can't read this inscription natively off the screen. This inscription has some characters visible on the stone, and the editor has restored some more characters. So kataskewe, and then there's something else across there, and the editor has decided that would be kataskewas there at the end of that word, and likewise the else at the end of that line must be from eusebastato. So this is simply supplied reason lost in both cases. However, there's also an unclear letter sigma in there. That's fine. However, what we actually have is that's not the end of the line. There are more lost characters that have not been restored by the editor after those restorations. And you see that in the Leiden system, there's only one set of square brackets around both the restoration and the lacuna. So what do? We put supplied reason lost around the restoration as usual, and then the lacuna is a gap as usual. There's a space between the two. Note I've added that space between the two because there's a word break there. Kataskewaste is a complete word, so we put a space in there because that's the convention. We want a space before the square brackets or in between the end of the word and the dots. And the attributes that gap takes, as I said, there's three required attributes in there. The reason is lost, the extent is unknown, the unit is character, so there's an unknown number of characters lost. And same for the second line, disappeared off the bottom of the screen there. What this turns into, I can already hear some people starting to picture this and starting to say, but wait a minute. If supplied reason lost puts square brackets around as there, correct? And if gap reason lost puts brackets around the dots, correct? Won't that give us this? Square brackets after the as there, a space, more square brackets opening before the three dots. That's perfectly logical, but I can hear any epigrapher or papyrologist in the room screaming at this point and saying, this looks terrible, this is not what we want to see in our editions. That's okay. The EpiDoc reference style sheets recognize that you never want to see a closing square bracket followed by an opening square bracket, and will simply omit them for you and give you back to this view that you want to see. So the markup supplied followed by gap is always correct. Okay. Okay. Second example. This part of this inscription is uncertainly restored. So we can see there at the end of that, we can see dedo at the end of that line, which the editor has restored as dedochthai te boule, with a question mark. That's slightly uncertain. What do we do with that question mark? Well, we say supplied reason lost around the part in square brackets, as always, but the question mark we represent with a cert equals low, meaning my certainty in restoring this is lower than usual. Okay, my certainty in providing a restoration is never 100%, but this is even lower than usual. However, I think that when the editor says dedochthai te boule question mark, the editor actually is saying dedochthai, usual degree of certainty, te boule, lower degree of certainty. Okay, so we can actually say, we can break that down in EpiDoc, and we can say supplied reason lost thigh, supplied reason lost cert equals low, te boule. Which again, you're going to look at this and you're going to think, well, but then I'm going to get a closing square bracket after dedochthai and a new opening square bracket before te boule, which I don't want. Do you see where I'm going? These standard style sheets will again see those square brackets there, say you don't want those in there, and it'll get rid of them for you. Third example, there may be other features in your text that you want to tag, and here's an example from the Inscriptions of Roman Cyrenaica. This is a squeeze, as you can see, not a photograph of the stone itself, it's a paper impression of the stone. There may be other features that you've tagged in the text which overlap with the lacuna that you're restoring, and as Polly has already demonstrated, overlapping is not allowed in XML. Which sometimes causes problems because overlapping happens all the time in real text. So at the end of this line, we have Gnaiu Corneliu. Okay, and so the standard thing to do is to put EU Corneliu in. It's in square brackets, so we put it in the supplied reason lost tag. And I'm leaving out the reason lost just because to save space on the screen, because that's going to become quite a long example. But we then want to say that Gnaiu is a name, because we want to index names in this corpus, and we also want to say that Corneliu is a name, because we index names in this corpus. Having done that, we now have overlapping tags, and I think you can see, if you did that in Oxygen, you would get a squiggly underline, a slightly neater squiggly underline than this, appearing in your Oxygen editor, going all the way up until the erroneous closing tag there, and it would say this is ill-formed XML. So what do you do? The simplest thing to do is to say that the name is semantic information that we need for indexing purposes, whereas the supplement, the supplied tag, it doesn't matter. It's still true to say that EU is supplied and Corneliu is supplied as in two separate elements. Okay, so we can break that into two separate elements, and you see what's coming again. Gnaiu Corneliu, there will be, you might expect to see extra square brackets in there, but the style sheets know to omit them. The moral of this story is that you should always be encoding the semantics. This character is restored, regardless of how many times you have to break those elements up, rather than trying to worry about how this is going to display, because that's something that the XSLT developer, the person who wrote those style sheets that we're using, will make sure that it looks as it should do. Okay, so you mark it up to say this is what it means, and someone else will deal with how it should look. And over to Polly for the final bit of tutorial there. You're still muted, Polly.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so that slide, the very important slide that Gabi showed you that contained all the different things that we can do in EpiDoc, the cheat sheet, is something that will give you a lot more information about this. But I am going to show you now a few cases of editorial interventions, editorial corrections that we can encode, and I will show you how to do those, just so that you are more confident when you have to do it on your own. So the first case is editorial supplement. And it is when the scribe has written something which the editor believes needs something more, when something has been omitted by the scribe according to the editor. Here, it's not immediately obvious, but this is the English word deceased, because this is a tombstone. And apparently the scribe has omitted few of the letters that we have there. And in a normal critical edition, we would have the missing letters supplied inside angle brackets as so. What we do in XML, in EpiDoc, is to give a supplied element, like Gabi showed you a few minutes ago, and we always give it the reason omitted. We are supplying this letter here, and the reason for that is that the scribal omitted to write it on the stone. And we do the same with the other missing letters. Here we can do another thing. We see that our scribe has also written a fancy inverted S, whether by design or by accident, we can't say for sure. But we are also able to identify this S by giving it this element high with an attribute rend and reversed. Then we might want to do the opposite when we have something on the stone that the stonecutter put there, but the editor believes it does not belong in that word. Here, what we have is the end of some word and then the word doulos. But our scribe has written both the ligature of the omicron and the upsilon and an additional omicron to the left. And what we would do here, again, when we are tagging this in the Leiden convention, we would put these squiggly brackets around the superfluous letter, and we would indicate that this is a ligature. And this is how we do it in XML. We use the surplus element for the letter that we believe does not belong there. And again, for the ligature, we can use this high element. Then we can have cases where we don't want to say that something is missing or that something has been put there as a surplus in the word that we are commenting on, but in fact, we want to correct what the scribe has written. And here we have a charming example from a hotel room from epigraphical convention a few years ago, where we have dear quest, when in fact our scribe perhaps meant dear guest. And in this case, since this is an obvious error, obvious typo in this case, we are using this upper square brackets to indicate that this is an error that we are correcting. The way we tag this in EpiDoc is with the core element surrounding the letter that we are correcting to. So in this case, the G. However, if we want to actually show, if we have access to whatever was written before, we have exerted our editorial power over it and corrected it. Because in some cases, when we are only working with an edition and we have not seen the monument itself, we might not know that there is a Q hidden behind this correction to a G. So in this case, we would only have the core element. But if we have seen and we know that we are correcting a Q to a G, in this case, we use the choice element, which is the parent of the core element. And we have an additional thing here, the seek element that surrounds whatever was already on the stone or on the note left for the guests of the hotel. So we put the thing that was there in a SIG, we put our correction in a core, and both of those go inside a choice element. It is very common in inscriptions and in papyri that we see scribal inversion. So here our scribe has written anerthe, when in fact he probably meant anerete. In this case, we again use the choice element with a SIG that is presenting what we have on the papyrus and a core that contains whatever we are correcting this to. And this allows us, again, whenever we're doing the XSLT transformations, to choose which one we are displaying at this moment. If we want to have the editorial version, the critical edition, we'll have the corrected piece of that word. If we want to show what was on the stone, we can display the content of the SIG, and is therefore very useful to separate them and encode them both. And in some other cases, yet we don't really want to talk about errors and mistakes that the scribe has committed, but we're talking about regularization and normalization of the language. So we have some standard language that we learn at school, at the university, but there are many non-standard varieties that appear in our documents and in our monuments. And it is more correct to refer to those as non-standards and not as errors. For example, here we have something that appears very often in monuments in Northern Africa, where it says Vixit in pace, when standard Latin would be Vixit in pace, written like this. So in this case, rather than tagging this as a scribal error, we can tag it as a choice, a regularization of a dialect, of something that is not the standard. Again, we would use the choice element, but we would, whenever we are regularizing, we would use the reg and oric combo. So we put our correction, our regularization in the reg element, and whatever is on the stone in the oric. Now, here we can see that different projects have different approaches toward this. For example, you can put the choice and the reg and oric only around the letters that you're trying to regularize, or you might prefer to put them around the entire word that is being regularized. And this is a matter of choice. There are pros and cons to both approaches. It has to do basically with how you want your apparatus to be in the end, or what you consider to be the more salient piece of information. For example, if you're regularizing words for the case ending, it makes more sense that you put the choice and the reg and oric around the entire word, rather than just on the endings that you're regularizing. But these are all, nitty-gritties of how the particular project has decided to do it. For example, this is something that is done in the Duke database, and this is something that some epigraphic projects are employing. So again, it's up to the people and the editor-in-chief who gets to decide what you do, but both are equally possible. So just to summarize, whether to act per letter or per word is project-specific. Leiden only allows you to show the correction or the diplomatic thing, but we in EpiDoc, and thanks to TEI, get to encode both in parallel. And this allows us to be more flexible. And with the same XML document, thanks to its rich encoding, to be able to generate different things like apparatus, or maybe you want to do some fancy display. You can have the two letters, the original and the one that you are regularizing to, superimposed so that you can see them both, or you can have a hover over image. So the sky, or rather one's imagination, is the limit here, and this is all made possible and available by this tagging with XML in the EpiDoc framework. And now to the exercise, if we still have time for that.
Yes.
Yeah. So we can talk briefly about the exercise. Let me put that on the full screen. Maybe I'll make that a little larger as well. So the exercise we propose for this session is for you to install the Oxygen XML editor, or if you prefer, there's other alternatives, but Oxygen is the one we demonstrated, and it has a lot of nice features that will help you, including dynamic validation and so forth. And then create, choose 2 or 3 inscriptions or papyri, or find some broken gravestones in your native language if you prefer to use a modern language than the ancient languages, and create an EpiDoc file for each one. This, for now, will only be encoding the Greek and Latin or English or whatever other language text. But keep the files, because in a couple of weeks we'll be talking about how to encode the description of an object and its other historical information, so we can use your same examples for that. We've given you here on the GitHub page, we've given you a link to that quick reference sheet that we showed you in the slide earlier. We've given you a link to an XML template, which is the one I was editing in Oxygen. And we've linked to a few places where you can find files that have already been marked up. And you can go to these projects. Whenever you look at an inscription in any one of these projects, there will be a link on that page to where you can download the EpiDoc file, so you can look at how other projects have done it. And then if you've got your own ideas for what text you want to encode, absolutely great. But if you want some examples from us, you could go to either the EpiDoc, the Epigraphic Database Heidelberg or the Epigraphic Database Rome. Both of those do use EpiDoc. But not as visibly as some of these other sites, and download a Latin inscription from one of those, or just copy and paste from the page the Latin inscription from that into your file, as I did with the Ostracon. And there's a couple of suggestions of some relatively interesting files we've given here under these 4 links. If you want a Greek inscription, you could use the PHI database, Package Humanities Institute, or the Attic Inscriptions Online, or others, and we've given a couple of examples again here for you to use if you want. If you don't want to spend ages leafing through to find something interesting. Likewise, if you prefer papyri, those will mostly be in Greek, although as you saw, I used an Ostracon which was in Latin from that site, and we've given a couple of suggestions there. And if you want to do some inscriptions in English, here is an archive, a zip file, which has some photographs of some broken gravestones or some other texts that are broken in the way that inscriptions sometimes are. And you can pick one of those and create an edition in EpiDoc of one of those texts. And a couple of suggestions there. You'll have to follow the file names within that archive. I couldn't link directly to the file. And so just have a go, discuss it with other people in your class or in your group. And prepare to bring those along next week to your tutor, and we'll have a look at those. Almost certainly you will come up with something in just a few examples that there might be an ambiguity as to how you should encode it, or that nevertheless will be something interesting for us to talk about. You can also use the Issues tab in GitHub here at the top of the page. If you come across anything really interesting, you want to ask a question about, a technical question about EpiDoc or about the Oxygen XML editor or anything else to do with this session, you can use those. We have an optional second exercise, which is for those of you who don't mind a little bit more of a challenge, which will also allow you to see how your EpiDoc file will look when transformed into a web page, which should be more human readable. Okay, so you'll get something that looks more like Leiden rather than that XML, and it'll also help you to get a sense of whether you've marked it up correctly or you've got the output that you were expecting from there. So you can follow these instructions to download and install the EFES platform. It is normally very straightforward, very, very easy. When I said a little bit more challenging, I just meant it'll take a little bit more time. There's nothing difficult about this, unless you are the 1 in 12 people. And so, for example, of my students, my guess is it'll happen to one person. Apologies if you're the unlucky one. where there is a slight incompatibility between EFES and something on your computer. I have no idea what happens in that case. You almost certainly can find someone who can fix it, but that person isn't me. But this is also another reason why it's a good reason to be working in groups. So you can try it out on someone else's machine if it doesn't work directly on yours. So you can look at these instructions. There's even another YouTube video just less than 20 minutes long, in which Polly and I and our colleague Irene will walk you through installing EFES and displaying some EpiDoc files in it, something we made earlier this year. So that's as I say, that part's optional. If you don't want that extra trouble, just mark up 2 or 3, or if you've chosen shortish texts, maybe do 5 or 6. But make sure you've got a good couple of hours work to really get into EpiDoc by trying out some of these examples. So that's about it, I think, for the exercise. Does anyone have anything else to add, or if anyone has any questions in the chat, we'll keep an eye on those.
Yes, so don't be shy to ask questions. I understand that this was a really version in Epigraphy and EpiDoc. And if you have any questions, considering also your background, so really you can ask the questions in the chat. As Gabby was saying, you can use the issues in GitHub, where we can keep track of your questions about this session. And I think the one important thing that we could see is that again, so when we start encoding these texts, so we have to be consistent, we have to focus, again, always on our research question. What do we want to encode? This is important. So when you start also with your exercise and you have links to different collections in different languages, you also have pictures, focus on those pictures, on the text, and also in these resources you can find commentaries about the text, possibly translations. So focus on the text and then on the editorial notes, and then you can try to encode your text. This is especially for humanists, so the temptation is to encode everything, but that's the thing. So always focus on, of course, in this case, we want to edit the text to represent in a computational way the editorial contributions of scholars, but there are different levels. So the stone, and then the work of the editor of the philology and the philologist, and then the third level is the level of the encoder, which is always in the end an act of interpretation. So we think that the illusion is to be neutral, but in the end we are not. Also when I think, this is at least my my experience and my thought about that. So encoding in any case is always interpreting in some way the text.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Monica. What we've shown you so far in this video was how to encode those essential features of the text, which this would not be an epigraphic edition without them. And in an ideal world, in a world where simplifications were acceptable, we could probably say that if the 3 of us were each to mark up the same edition in EpiDoc, we would all come up with exactly the same XML. Now, in fact, there'll be a little bit of variation in there, but not much. Square brackets has to be supplied reason loss. There's no other way of doing it. There's no interpretation in there. We might slightly differ on where we put, the cert equals low attribute, whether we break it into 2 supplied elements or not, things like that. But essentially, we'd be doing the same thing. Where it becomes an active interpretation, I mean, that is still an active interpretation. But in this case, the interpreter and the editor, the encoder and the editor are the same person. Where it becomes a more intrusive act of interpretation is where we start tagging things, as we saw in 1 or 2 of those examples, like names, like words, like titles, like places, like keywords, other things that we might tag in the text in order to index them, or in order to be able to search them, or do other kinds of processing on them. such as linguistic processing, grammatical processing, the sort of thing that Polly also does with papyrological text. And there, it is impossible to do any kind of encoding without making an active interpretation. Even if someone else has told you what it is they want you to encode, by choosing how to encode it, you have intervened in that text, and you've become one of the authors of that text, whether the person who runs the project is willing to admit you are or not. You are. So if you look at some of those examples that we pointed to on the GitHub page, from the inscriptions of Greek Cyrenaica, the inscriptions of the Northern Black Sea, or the catalogue of Greek ritual norms, many of those will have tagged other things in addition to the transcription features of the text itself. They'll have tagged personal names. They'll have tagged titles, religious terminology, things that they want to be indexed. And that'll make the text even messier than the XML you saw in my example. There'll be much more tagging going on in there, but they can still produce a nice, neat addition from it, plus all this indexing. So if you want to think while you're doing this encoding about what other things you might tag in there, please feel free to put in some other tags. You can see, once you type an angle bracket, or if you press Command E on your keyboard, you'll see a menu pop up saying what tags are available to you here. You can also make some up. It'll say it's not valid, but so long as it's well formed, that won't actually break anything. So feel free to just put in some nonsense tags in there for the time being. We wouldn't want to publish based on that, but it's okay while we're playing for the purposes of this exercise. And try to tag people, places, titles, anything else that you might think of in the text that is interesting to tag, and if that causes overlapping with other tags and therefore it's ill-formed and therefore it is broken, then you have to figure out how to resolve that, how to resolve those overlapping. So that again, it's a series of different interesting questions, technical and conceptual, that you'll be addressing in that. So that's a really nice thing to sort of experiment with. We hadn't got on to how you tag things for indexing in this presentation, but I mean we'll mention that a little bit in 2 weeks' time. Some things that are tagged for that purpose, but outside of the text. But that's something you could already start experimenting with. And as Monica says, every tag you put in the text is an active interpretation of one kind or another. The same is true if every square bracket you put in a text in a Leiden edition is an active interpretation.
Yes, and then, as Gabriel was saying, so experiment with these exercises, also because in the end, the final goal is not only to preserve the text and the editorial work of other scholars of our work, but then extract information from these inscriptions. And there are many different kinds of information that we can extract. And then definitely, for example, names are important also because today, we need in digital philology, in digital classics, in the digital humanities to extract more information from our ancient text. So there is a lot of work for literary text, but for inscriptions, papyri, we already have many, let's say, digital editions, or at least machine readable text, but we need to extract more data. And by data, we mean many different things, of course, names of people, but then, of course, the grammar, for example, and Polina is working a lot on this for papyri, for example. So there is a lot of work that has to be done. Anyway, so I don't see questions in the chat. So in general, remember that during these sessions, as you see, you can use the chat in YouTube for asking any questions you have. So don't be shy, really. I know that these sessions are online, but our purpose is an educational one. We know that we have a mixed audience with people with different backgrounds, not only in the humanities, but also in computer science. So the goal is to learn. We are learning by doing Sunoikis digital classes, we know that. So we are here, first of all, to learn new things. And so your questions are important also for us for the program.
I'd just reiterate that by saying, not only do we welcome questions, we will accept any question you might ask, whatever, however silly or basic you may think it is. But I'd go further and say we expect and even demand questions. These sessions are incomplete without your questions. So please, I mean, you may not have any questions in the last 4 minutes, but for future reference, please always ask questions. We want as many questions as possible. It's great. Could I maybe ask a question if no one else is doing yet? I have a question for Polly. It has been far too long since I learned EpiDoc for the first time. Can you remember when you were first introduced to EpiDoc, how hard was it to become the expert that you are today? Or let's how hard was it before you felt comfortable and you didn't have to look at the cheat sheet for every single thing you did?
Right. I think the turning point is when you stop being afraid of what you're doing. Because especially when we start using XML in the editor and we start making errors and everything is red and nothing is well formed, and it feels like it's the end of the world and you are paralyzed and you don't want to do anything. But we need to keep in mind that this is something that can always be fixed. You're still learning. It's fine if everything is broken. You can experiment, you can try things out. And just a calm and leveled approach to things is always the best thing. And there is also, quite a sensible and even tractable learning curve in this. So if XML seems something that is very difficult for you now, as soon as you get the hang of it, EpiDoc doesn't seem so scary anymore. There is just a set of rules that you need to memorize, and then everything is simple. And once you get the hang of how to write XML and how to follow the rules of EpiDoc, then the next step, writing XSLT transformation scenarios for XML, is something that, again, is maybe not that difficult for you. So my advice for people that are now just starting with digital humanities and with XML and EpiDoc in particular is to just keep calm and carry on. And once you get to play with things, it really becomes something that you can enjoy.
I would like to add one thing. So I think that is important also to find, for example, your text. If you have, again, the research question is fundamental, because I can say, okay, I want to learn EpiDoc. I can find tutorials, I can follow this session, but then in the end, you don't get it. When you begin to have, for example, a text, and this is valid for other markup languages, also for programming languages, when you have your text, your specific problem because you're working on a research paper, on a dissertation, etc., then you will get into it. Of course, it's always difficult at the beginning, but when you know the text or you have specific problems you need to solve, then I think this is the turning point when you can begin to learn, for example, EpiDoc or other markup languages. This is at least my experience. I know that it's difficult to find something, but for example, also for the audience in this session, if you are not a classicist, if you don't have a Greek or Latin inscription, well, find a text. We have modern and contemporary inscriptions in the place we live in, so in our cities or in villages, etc. We can find text. So start with them, and then of course, if you have a specific problem in your work, and for people with a background in computer science, maybe you can try to understand, okay, the problem is on the other side, okay, how we can use a language like XML for representing historical documents where there are specific issues, okay? So, okay, there is a question from the universe. Are we expected to submit the exercises in some way? Well, the goal for, so the final, okay, expectation for students in Leipzig is in the end is to focus on one of the topics presented in these sessions, to discuss them, and then you can arrange everything for that. If you choose a specific topic, yes, you are expected to submit the exercise in some way, and then of course you can email me if you have any questions. Yes, of course.
The same is true. The same is true for students. My students in London. That there is one possible exercise you might do for the assessment that would involve using XML, and therefore I would want to see the XML. For this exercise, in general, what most people will do is they will do the exercise, they will discuss it with each other, and they will discuss it then with the whole class and with me in the seminar next week. As a general answer to that question for Sunoikisis, no, there isn't particularly a need to submit anything. The point is to do this exercise, try it out yourself, ideally discuss it with other people if you can. If you're watching this either live or if you're watching this in 5 years' time to learn something about it, and you're not part of a class and you don't have a group of other people who are also watching this and studying this to share with, feel free to get in touch with us. We're always happy to hear about people who use Sunoikisis, live or otherwise. As part of university learning or independently, and we'd be happy to. I mean, I can't promise that we'll look at 100 EpiDoc files for you and correct them, but we're happy to have a conversation about this sort of thing. So yes, we're a very friendly community, and if you do have 100 EpiDoc files that you want people to look at and answer things, then there are venues to do that are not personal emails to us, but we can point you in those directions. But so there's a slight. I just sort of wanted to make that clear that there's sort of two different questions here. There's questions about, from Monica's students, Monica, what do we have to do? And my students, and then there's questions on Sunoikisis more broadly. And so, we can answer the former on Sunoikisis more broadly. There is, we're providing these exercises for you to play with, not, we're not providing, Sunoikisis is not providing assessment or accreditation for any of this.
Yes, exactly. So this is something that is done locally. Okay, for example, for me, Leipzig, for Gabriel in London, and other people who want to use Sunoikis, then of course they are responsible locally for assessment. Yeah. Okay, so
I wanted to come back very quickly to your point, Monica, about finding your own text, and that's when you really get into EpiDoc, when you've got your own text and you're answering your own problems through that. I just wanted to sort of reiterate that that's something that will be true of many of the sessions this semester. When you're doing this as an example, as an exercise with a text that we provided you with, and it's really quite arbitrary, and it may be in a language you don't know very well, or it may not. It's a little bit abstract, it's a little bit hard to really get into. You may understand the principles, but when you're doing it with a text that you're working on and that you want to know more about, actually marking that text up in EpiDoc does tell you more about the text, because you have to make decisions. You say, well, actually, what did those parentheses mean? Because this doesn't look like an abbreviation, yet he's put parentheses in it. So you start getting closer to the text, and you start to say, and the same is true for all of these, and we'll be quite explicitly saying that for the sessions on tree banking, for example, for the sessions on translation alignment. Looking at these tools makes you look at your texts really closely, and is part of learning experience. Even aside from the stated digital goals, just the amount of attention you pay to the text can also teach you something about your own text.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so now, unfortunately, our time is over, so we have to finish the session. Next week, we have another session, which is a different topic, text analysis with the Voyant tools. And then in 2 weeks, we will have another session about text encoding, but for encoding objects. So I thank you very much for this session. See you next week. And good night, good afternoon, good morning. I know that we have people in different time zones. So see you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.